So the preterit tense has a set of irregulars just like the present tense does and just like the future tense did. So some of these verbs are going to look really familiar, and they're grouped into three major categories, into U group, I group, and J group. And then we have a group that are really irregular. So these 7 verbs are our U group, which means that in the preterit tense, you're going to add a U into the root of the word, what comes before the AR, ER, or IR. And that change is going to carry through even in the nosotros form. And if you look to the right, those are the endings that we're going to use for those verbs. And it's not going to matter whether the verb is an AR verb, an ER verb, or an IR verb. We use these endings for any verb that's in this chart. So all of our irregulars. So if we look at a star as an example of a U group verb, we start with our root, which is estuve, and if you notice, it's going to be the same in all of our forms, even in the nosotros form. And then we're going to add the endings from the chart on the previous slide. So we get estuve, estuviste, estuvo, estuvimos, estuvieron. Okay, let's take a look at another U group example, andar, which means to walk. You can use caminar as well, which is a regular verb, but it's good to know that there is a synonym and that that synonym is one of our U group verbs. So to start out to conjugate, just like we did with a star, we're going to put the root, which is what comes before the AR, which is anduve. And once we have that, we're going to pick our endings from our chart and we're going to add those to the end of the root. So we get anduve, anduviste, anduvo, anduvimos, anduvieron. All right, let's take a look at the verb poder. First, we want to write our root in. So in each section of our verb chart, let's write the root of poder, which is pud, P-U-D. So that's the first step. The second step is going to be to add your endings. So go ahead and add your endings for your different forms. So you should have pude, pudiste, pudo, pudimos, pudieron. Okay, let's practice on our own. You have the verbs poner, tener, saber, and caber left in your packet. Take a second, go through, and write in the correct forms in your verb charts for those 4 verbs. When you're done, click to advance the slide so you can check your answers. The correct forms of poner in the preterit are puse, pusiste, puso, pusimos, pusieron. Tener in the preterit is tuve, tuviste, tuvo, tuvimos, tuvieron. Saber in the preterit is supe, supiste, supo, supimos, supieron. We learned that saber means to know a fact, but in the preterit tense, more often than not, it translates to find out. So if you said yo supe, it would translate to I found out. And our last U group verb is caber, and the correct forms are cupe, cupiste, cupo, cupimos, cupieron. Our next group of preterite irregulars is the I group, and there's only 3 verbs here: hacer, venir, and querer. And if you look to the far right in the chart, you're going to see that they use the same endings as our U group verbs did. Now these are going to add an I in. So for hacer, our root becomes is. For venir, it becomes vin, and for querer, it becomes quis. And then you would add the endings in the right-hand column. Now, hacer has an irregular within an irregular. So it is in the I group, so it has that I change. But then when you see the usted, el, and ella form of the verb, it's going to have another change. The C is going to change to a Z, and we'll look at that on the next slide. For the verb hacer, we start just like we did with our U groups and adding the root. So if you look at the yo form, we have the root is, and then we add our ending e, so we get ise. We do the same thing in the to form, and we get isiste. But if you look at the usted, el, and ella form, this is where we have the irregular within the irregular. So the C changes to a Z, and that's just to help with the pronunciation of the word in Spanish. So the usted, el, and ella form is iso. So in your packet, this is circled just to highlight it for you so you remember that there's an extra change. When we go to the nosotros, we add our root again, is, and then our ending, imos, so we get hicimos. And our ustedes, ellos, and ellas form is hicieron. So let's practice with our other 2 verbs in the I group, venir and querer. Take a second and go through the charts in your packet and write down the forms for venir and for querer. When you're done, you can advance the slide and check your answers. So our correct preterite tense forms of venir are vine, viniste, vino, vinimos, vinieron. Our correct preterite tense forms of querer are quise, quisiste, quiso, quisimos, quisieron. Querer is very rarely used in the preterite tense, and when it's in the positive form, it means to try, and when it's in the negative form, no quise or no quisiste, it means to refuse to do something. So we don't see this verb very often in the preterite tense, but we still need to know how it changes. So our last group of preterite irregulars are our J group, and this group does a couple of funny things besides just having the J. So our 4 major verbs in this group are decir, traer, conducir, and traducir. So let's start with decir. This is another one that will have an irregular within an irregular. We're going to have a J, but we're also going to change the E to an I. So our root of decir in the preterite is dij, dich. For traer, our root is trach, traj. Conducir is conduch, conduj, and traducir is traduch, traduj. And as we go on and look at the conjugations of these verbs, we're going to notice that the ustedes, ellos, and ellas form is going to have a little bit of an irregularity compared to our other preterite irregulars. So our verb decir in the preterite changes to dije, dijiste, dijo, dijimos, dijeron. So notice that we also have that I in all of our forms. But the place you want to be really careful is in the ustedes, ellos, and ellas. So if you look at dijeron, we actually dropped the I of the ending. So instead of I-E-R-O-N, we're just using E-R-O-N. We're going to do this for all of our J group verbs. So if you look at your verb chart, you're going to notice there's a circle there to remind you. So we want to be careful with this when we're conjugating. So go ahead and try to conjugate traer, conducir, and traducir in the preterite tense. Be very careful with that ustedes, ellos, and ellas form. Follow the example from decir. When you're done, you can advance the slide and check your answers. Okay, so our forms of traer in the preterite are traje, trajiste, trajo, trajimos, trajeron. Traje can also mean suit, so we have to look at the context of the sentence to decide whether it's the verb traje or the noun traje. Our preterite tense forms of conducir are conduje, condujiste, condujo, condujimos, condujeron. Remember that we also have manejar, which is another way to say to drive, and that verb is irregular in the preterite tense. So our preterite tense forms of traducir are traduje, tradujiste, tradujo, tradujimos, tradujeron. In the preterite, we also have 4 verbs that are really irregular verbs. They don't fit any of the patterns that we've talked about. And those 4 verbs are ir, ser, dar, and ver. So let's take a look at how we conjugate those verbs. Okay, so let's start with the verb ir, which some of you probably remember from middle school. So our preterite tense forms of ir are fui, fuiste, fue, fuimos, fueron. The most common mistake that people make is that they mix up when to use fui and when to use fue. So a little trick to remember is that yo in Spanish means I, so the yo form ends in I. That may help you to remember where they go. Now if we look at the verb of ser in the preterite, it's fui, fuiste, fue, fuimos, fueron. Look familiar? Ser and ir have the exact same conjugations in the preterite tense, so you need to use context to decide which verbs are being used. Ser isn't used all that frequently in the preterite, so it'll probably be ir, but just to be safe, we want to make sure we know ser as well. Okay, the verb dar in the preterite is di, diste, dio, dimos, dieron. This is grouped in with our really irregulars because it's an AR verb, but we use ER-IR verb endings. The reason we do this is because if we used our AR endings, it would already be another word in Spanish. So to avoid even more confusion, we just use the ER and IR endings. And then our last in our really irregular chart is ver. And our forms of ver are vi, viste, vio, vimos, vieron. We group this into this chart because it doesn't add accent marks. A regular preterite has accent marks in different places, so we put the verb ver in this chart to remind ourselves that we don't need accents here.